So today's topic is Agile. Is it worth it or is it overrated? Now, a lot of developers have a lot of different opinions on this, and I've been looking around the internet to see what my fellow programmers think, and it seems that we're in agreement. And that is not necessarily that Agile is bad, but the way that it's been used on a lot of projects just doesn't work. Now, there's a few interesting things that I've seen both in videos and articles, and it really comes down to a few common basic points that people are bringing out. One of them is the excessive use of meetings. So the feeling there is that meetings are being overused, that there's a lot of time wasted in meetings where all you're doing is pretty much a status report and nothing is being moved forward. If you were stuck before, maybe you're still stuck, but now everyone knows the status, and that's about it. You could have used that time, whether it was 15 minutes or sometimes longer, you could have used that time to actually work on code. And then there's other thoughts out there about some of the ways Agile is being used, as far as estimating stories, where in software development, it's really hard to give a concrete estimation that translates into hours. And part of the reason for that is as complexity increases, the ability to estimate how long it's going to take to solve a task gets way worse. So if you have a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of code where a tiny story where the whole thing is going to involve a one line code change, you likely can estimate that, especially if you're familiar with the code. You know where that one line is, you know what needs to be done. You could probably rightly say, hey, I could go change that code and test it properly in less than 10 minutes. And you're probably 100% correct. But then when you get to some more complicated stories, you get into the situation where you don't know all the pieces involved off the top of your head. There are a lot of unknowns. If something isn't working right, it's because of those interactions of several pieces in the software. And in order to maybe troubleshoot it, to fix it, or to add a new feature, you're going to have to wrap your head around multiple pieces of code, and not only the pieces themselves, but also the way they connect together. And once you get in there, you might have a basic idea of how you're going to approach the problem, but you get in there and you find there's some surprises. There's an aspect of the code that you didn't think about when you were estimating this problem. And now you have started out with something that you felt very confident would take you 2 hours, and now it's going to take you 2 days. And it gets worse when you go to stories that maybe you're implementing a very complicated feature and you look at it and you say, oh, this will probably take me a week. It'll take about 5 days. Now things are really getting tricky, because perhaps it will take you 5 days, but it could also just as easily take you 10 days. And so how do you translate any of that into hours? If it's going to be vague anyway at the level of a day, how can you say, oh, okay, so this task right here is going to take me 40 hours to do? You really don't know that. And so a lot of developers have gotten onto teams where stories are estimated very strictly based on hours. And what they find is those estimates are way off. They're not even close. And so as a developer in that situation, you're either going to feel really bad because you're consistently falling behind based on the estimate, or someone's going to speak up and there's going to be consequences because you're consistently falling behind on due to the estimate. Or on the other hand, maybe your team starts to completely ignore the estimate because it's at that point it's meaningless. Whenever you're using hours and you have a task that was estimated at 10 hours and very consistently you know that's probably going to take you 15 to 20 hours, or maybe it'll take 5 hours. Now your estimates are meaningless, you're probably going to start ignoring them if there aren't any consequences of falling behind those estimates. And so you can see the problem pretty quickly when it comes to estimating stories based on hours. Now, let's take a step back for a second, because clearly there are some issues with those two things, just those two aspects that are commonly associated with Agile, that of following specific meetings throughout the sprint and that of estimating tasks based or stories based on hours. Those two things introduce a lot of problems in themselves. But the question here now is that really agile? And the answer is no. Those things belong to specific applications of agile, but in and of themselves, you don't have to follow those things in order to be following agile. So what I did, because I was really thinking on the topic, is I looked up the Agile Manifesto. And let me just read this, just a few points from it. And I'm going to remove these because eye strain. But okay. So here's what the Agile Manifesto is: tools and interactions over processes and tools. So, I mean, that makes sense. We want to look at people over process, the individuals working on the project, plus the clients that are involved, the users, are going to be more important than the specific processes and tools that you use. Working software over comprehensive documentation, once again, makes sense. While documentation can be useful, especially if you're trying to troubleshoot how to integrate an API and you're not able to find enough documentation, really. But if you have great documentation and no software, then you don't really have a product at all. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. Yes, that makes sense. You want to be working with your clients so that you can deliver what they actually need, rather than trying to write down in a contract specifically what you're building. It's more important that you continually adjust and work with your customer to ultimately deliver them what they actually need, even if they didn't fully know what they needed at the beginning. Responding to change over following a plan. So yes, absolutely. When you're working in software development, there's going to be surprises. Even if you have a well-constructed plan, it doesn't matter. There will be surprises. The client will realize something that they forgot to mention, and so now the requirements are going to change. Or as you start building the application and the client sees it, they realize that one of the requirements that they thought they needed was actually wrong, and there has to be an adjustment, because once it's coming together, now they can see it's not quite working. So yeah, that absolutely is the case. Now, the other thing that's interesting about this manifesto is with each statement, the first part, which is on the left of the sentence, is a little bit bigger font than the one on the right side. So if you go to agilemanifesto.org, you'll actually see that. You'll see the font. The font size is actually a little bit, there's a difference there in the font size. This is not coming through very good, but go check it out. It's agilemanifesto.org, and you'll be able to see that for yourself. But it says, that is, while there is value on the items on the right, we value the items on the left more. That means that last point there, for example, responding to change over following a plan, there is value that acknowledges there is value when it comes to following a plan, but there's more value when it comes to responding to change. So Agile isn't even saying just start working without a plan and just see how it goes as you go along. Agile is acknowledging here that a plan does have value. Now, whenever you're trying to figure out how you're going to work, you can prioritize following a plan over being adaptable, or on the other hand, you can prioritize being adaptable over strictly following a plan. And so all Agile is doing here is prioritizing adaptability over following a strict plan. But that doesn't rule out planning. So you could be following Agile if you have maybe you have a good detailed design of your end product right up at the front. You know exactly what you're wanting, but you're not going to build it all at once. You're going to be flexible in how you're building it. You're not committing to your full design 100%. You're open to changing it. That could still be considered Agile. So Agile does not exclude all planning. Another thing that is on there, Agile does not exclude doing documentation. We want to prioritize getting working software over having comprehensive documentation. However, that doesn't mean we ignore documentation. And people over processes, sure, we want to prioritize the people involved, whether that's the developers, the clients, the users, but we don't ignore processes and we don't ignore tools. So that's one interesting little thing there, just even looking at the manifesto itself. And you could see there's a lot of wiggle room in there. I'm not seeing a list of rules at this point. There's nothing in there about story points. There's nothing in there about stand-ups. There's nothing in there about sprint planning or sprint review. There's a lot of room. The whole idea there is getting something working, adaptability, and really paying attention to the perspective of the people involved. So let's move on now to the principles behind the Agile Manifesto. And this is where we get into a little bit more detail. And so you might think, well, maybe we'll find some rules in there. Well, looking at this, and I'm not going to read the entire thing, but once again, if you want to check it out, it's agilemanifesto.org. Just kind of scanning through here. The first thing is welcome changing requirements. So that is something in software, just by its very nature, is as you could upfront design the whole thing, commit to your requirements, and decide to never change them. But oftentimes in the real world, that's not going to be the case. Requirements are going to change. One of the biggest downsides to waterfall is if you design everything up front and then you begin coding, and then at the very end you have your testing, and then you deliver it, which, to be fair, was necessary back in the day when software was on a physical disk that had to be physically shipped. If you follow that process, it's possible, especially depending on the size of your software, that a client needs this specific software done in this specific way, and then it takes you 4 years to complete the software, and by the time you deliver it to the client, they now need something completely different. Especially now, technology is constantly changing, businesses are constantly changing. It's important to be adaptable to keep up, and that's one of the benefits of Agile, is that adaptability. So yeah, deliver working software frequently. says from a couple of weeks to a couple of months with preference to the shorter time scale. So even that, it doesn't say work within a 2-week sprint and deliver something. There's a lot of wiggle room. But the idea there, it's a principle. The idea is to build something quickly that someone could use. And the idea with that goes along with that is coding in an iterative process rather than saying, okay, we planned it, we coded it, we tested it, we're done. You might say, okay, we did this version that's very small that we were able to deliver in 2 months. Now the client is using it, they're evaluating it, they're coming back to us with what needs to change, and we can go back through and make a version 2 that is going to match their needs. And this iteration, we're actually going to be able to get this one done in just 1 month because it's only a few minor changes. Or maybe they found a lot of things they want to change and we're going to do a 3-month project. There's a lot of variability there that this allows. Business people and developers must work together daily throughout the project. Once again, there's a lot of wiggle room there. You can apply that in multiple ways. It doesn't mean that you have to have business people sitting in on every meeting, which could really slow down the development process. Let's see. Working software is the primary measure of progress. Let's see. Continuous attention to technical excellence and good design enhances agility. Yes. So if you're building good quality code, it's going to be easier to change it later. So if you have a good structure, it's clean, you aren't copying and pasting things everywhere. When the requirements change, it's going to be a whole lot easier to add something new. Or if you run into an issue that you didn't catch before, it's going to be easier to find the bug and fix it. And so that does enhance agility. Simplicity, which this one is interesting. The art of maximizing the amount of work not done is essential. And so the idea here is you're not over-engineering the product. You're not necessarily trying to build every possible feature that could go in that app. You're trying to build the features that are actually important to the client at that moment just to get them started. And then that idea of simplicity too kind of goes against some of the methods that are applications of Agile that introduce a lot of complexity into the process. The best architects' requirements and designs emerge from self-organizing teams, and the team tunes and adjusts its behavior as they reflect on how to become more effective. All right, so I didn't read every single one of those, but I probably read more of them than I intended to at first. But it's really interesting when you look at it. There are no rules. There's a lot of principles that can be followed. There's a lot of wiggle room. And it looks like the idea behind Agile is to be able to be flexible with your software development, to quickly adapt to client needs, to quickly adapt to changing requirements, but then also to change as a team, to evaluate yourself as a team and make those changes as needed. And now that one's interesting because that kind of implies that each team following Agile on each project with each different client is going to end up with a slightly different process or even a dramatically different process. And so, how does the idea of following one specific method of Agile that has very specific rules fit into that concept? Because remember, let's go back to the manifesto, people over process. Well, if you are following Scrum, not to say Scrum is good or bad, but let's say you're following Scrum, and that is a process. But your team, your people, are having problems with the rules of Scrum. for whatever reason on that project, it's just not working. Are you really being agile now if you continue to follow those rules without follow those rules strictly? Because now you're doing process over people instead of people over process. And so what I really get from that is if you're on a team and you're realizing things like these meetings are really dragging us down, we need to accomplish more. Well, you could use actual agile, to reflect as a team and say, hey, as a team, all of these meetings we're doing isn't working for us. We need to change something. You reflect, you change, and then now you're working more efficiently. And so, like, for example, with a stand up, if you found that your stand ups are turning into status reports, then maybe as a team, you might evaluate, do we need to continue to do stand ups? Or do we need to change how we do our stand ups if we're going to continue doing them? Now, I have seen stand ups that are very effective, and they're effective when the focus is on providing information to your team that allows you, if you're blocked, to get unblocked. If that's the focus of your stand up, then they're great. But if the focus of your stand up is just reporting, then yeah, it's not going to be effective. Of course, there are teams where maybe there's someone who needs to keep track of the bigger picture of the project. And in such a team like that, a status report might be very valuable because now that one person can hear the progress from each individual member on the team and know where everything is and be able to better guide the team towards whatever goal they're trying to accomplish. So each team's going to be different and each team is going to have different needs, but that is actually built into Agile itself. And now if we're going back to story pointing and hours, once again, people over process. If your people are feeling like they are not doing good enough because they can't live up to the hour estimates, then your process is really failing. Because, like I brought out before, it is the more complicated the task, the less likely you can actually estimate accurately. And so one way that I've seen as far as estimates, if you're going to do them, some teams might see, okay, it doesn't make sense for us as a team to estimate stories. We actually find that this is dragging us down. Instead, we want to estimate a whole feature and say, okay, doing this feature is going to take approximately this amount of time. And never commit to exactly this amount of time, because in software development, that's not going to be good unless it's a one-line code change. And that is genuinely a one-line code change and not something that has surprises in it. Or another team might realize, okay, well, let's estimate based on complexity. That kind of gives a proxy to hours, because you might say, okay, if I estimate this story at a complexity of 5, then as far as my team is concerned for this specific project, we all kind of have the idea that that task will take maybe 3 to 5 days. And it might take a little bit more, it might take a little bit less, but you kind of have an idea without being committed to specific hours. And so really all of this long ranting, just to go back to what actually, if you look at what Agile actually is, it's a way to be adaptable to each individual problem that you're trying to solve, to each individual team, to each individual project and client. And that's really a wonderful thing. And if you look at the actual manifesto and the principles, they're very adaptable. But if you look at some of the methods, which are not Agile, but are actually applications of Agile, you might find that, well, some of those things work great for your team. Other parts of them don't. And so I would suggest be inspired by some of the methods, but don't feel like you have to strictly follow them. Pick and choose which tools actually work for you on your team, on that specific project, and for that specific client. And that is actually truly agile.